An icy gale screamed through the Crescent Bay dockyards, setting the maze of cranes and shipping containers rattling as if crying out in pain. In his small shack, overlooking the piers, Richard shivered as he prepared for his night shift, the lone fluorescent bulb flickering erratically to cast uneven shadows. He pulled his frayed coat tighter, the bitter chill already seeping into his bones as he poured a cup of coffee with unsteady hands. Outside, the ocean swelled and crashed against the docks, the icy spray mingling with ribbons of fog that obscured the labyrinthine yard. Settling into his creaking chair, Richard tried to focus on paperwork, ignoring the groaning of metal and the slap of waves. As midnight approached, an uneasy feeling needled him, the repetitive tasks doing little to distract his wandering mind. The fluorescent bulb pulsed and dimmed, cloaking the office in moving shadows that played tricks on Richard's fatigued eyes. He glanced warily through the window, unable to see more than a few feet through the thick haze. Around 1 a.m., Richard first noticed the sound, faint murmurs and whispers swirling within the silver mist. The hair on the back of his neck prickled as the voices floated up from the direction of Dock 13. Richard's pulse quickened at the thought of that remote pier and its haunted tales, which he had always dismissed before. He paused, listening intently as the whispers sharpened into clearly distinct, if bodiless, speech. Curiosity slowly overtook apprehension as the voices beckoned from beyond the veil of fog. Richard's hands shook as he grabbed his flashlight, its beam barely penetrating the soup-like shroud. The biting chill intensified with each step as he picked his way haltingly through the metal labyrinth toward that mysterious pier. Even the coffee in his veins could not stop the shivering that now racked his body. Reaching Dock 13, Richard hesitated, his heart hammering against his ribs. He swept the flashlight's weak beam across the shadowy containers and dripping ropes, the mournful voices rising around him. The icy film of fog seemed to swirl and congeal into vague human shapes, their ragged outlines materializing from the mist. Richard stood paralyzed as the phantoms shuffled forward, their ghostly forms illuminating the darkness. Their faces were sunken and pallid, glowing with an unearthly sheen. The tattered uniforms they wore hung from their skeletal frames, stained with dark splotches that looked horribly like old blood. The phantom nearest to Richard turned its hollow eyes upon him, sending a spike of primal terror through his heart. The ghost's facial features were gaunt and elongated, its skin stretched taut over the bones. Behind its cracked, pale lips, Richard glimpsed the hint of tombstone teeth. Its bony hands reached out to him, long fingers curving like ghastly claws. The ghost's mournful cry fused with the howling wind, its distorted voice echoing from some unfathomable depth. Richard stumbled back, his own cry of fear lodged in his throat. More ragged specters crowded behind the first, their glow casting flickering shadows over the empty containers. As the ghosts shambled toward him, Richard finally found his voice again, a strangled yell of pure horror tearing from his lips. His trembling hands lost their grip on the flashlight, sending it clattering to the dock below. He whipped around in blind panic, fleeing the scene as the phantom's cries pursued him. Richard ran until his legs burned and his lungs screamed for air. Only once safely back in the office did he collapse, his heart threatening to pound through his chest. He knew none would believe his tale, but vowed never to work the night shift alone again, nor venture near the haunted Dock 13. Though few believed him, the legend spread, ensuring the site's infamy. The hulking tower rose with smooth lines and stark angles, throwing a dark silhouette over everything on the ground. The many men who punched in here day after day, their aspirations, their desires, what they kept hidden even from themselves inside. This beastly edifice spoke in the dead of night when all its inhabitants were absent. Mark, the stoic third-shift security guard, chuckled off stories about ghosts as wild imaginations and never believed such things could possibly be real. Reason was his shield and doubt his armor. Unbeknownst to him, the structure was harboring secrets which would soon make a spectacle of his skepticism. It started out small, with a little whisper. On one moonless evening, he walked through an empty corridor with his footsteps reverberating eerily. The whispers at first were just the wind playing tricks on him. However, as he neared their ear, the rumors became tangible, spoken in ghostly lip service, creating a labyrinth of tales in the shadows. The hair stood up on the back of his neck, but thinking it was just his imagination playing tricks on him, Mark pushed on and finished his walk, blaming the scary noises on over-imaginative exhaustion. It's not an uncommon condition in Florida. The whisper grew day in and night out, until the speed increased like the slow beating of a funeral bell in the distance. They crept out of obscured angles and floated through darkened corridors, filling Mark with an unsettling, nauseating feeling. The sounds, incomprehensible to the ear, as always, conveyed a sense of suffering. They seemed to be lost souls who never left this plane of existence. Inquiry and doubt urged him past the limits of sanity. He walked into a vast, transparent room at the top of this building, famous for having been the last location seen of an executive. As he stepped in, a cacophony of whispers swelled into a discordant orchestra with an icy draft filling the room. Shadowy dancers floated silently in the moonlight that spilt into the room. These ghosts fluttered, dancing like candle flames in the wind, as fleeting as cigarette smoke. Mark gasped a lungful of air. He wasn't the only one. And they were definitely ghosts, for such were the source of the incessant whispering. The phantoms had to be faced, said Mark, and he summoned up all of his courage. "Who are you? Who the hell are you, and what do you want?" he yelled. The spirits were mute, but nodded from side to side as they recognized the man's arrival. Then he spotted an antique table covered with dust in the corner, piles of papers and files scattered. In among these papers was a letter, written by the missing boss and sent just prior to his inexplicable disappearance. It was a statement, an admission of theft, corruption, practices which had caused the demise of the enterprise. He says, "Guilt, weighing on him as heavy as the darkness in the room, made the executive lose their mind and ultimately meet death in those same room." The murmurs grew louder until they were a crazed din, right on top of Mark as he looked down and read her letter. Their tortured faces seemed to beg him to discover the secret and take revenge on the bastard who was in charge. Mark knew all too well their cry for justice. The following days, Mark presented the disastrous letter to his bosses, which led to a probe. His legacy of corruption and web of deceit unraveled, the executive is done and dusted. As facts were revealed, the rumors subsided. They had served their purpose as the ghosts disappeared. Mark's experience changed him permanently, wiping out his cynicism and branding with him the harrowing story. He knew the secrets of the office building deepened at night, when the whispers from the past called out to him and malevolent spirits lurked deep within the shadows. I'd heard the stories about St. Michael's Asylum, the abandoned mental institution that loomed on the outskirts of town. They said it was a place where madness had festered, where patients had been subjected to unspeakable horrors. But when I found myself desperate for a job, the offer of a night shift security position at St. Michael's was one I couldn't refuse. As I pulled up to the decrepit building on my first night, I felt a sense of dread that clung to me like a shadow. The entrance to the asylum was a set of imposing double doors, covered in peeling paint and framed by cracked, stained glass. As I stepped inside, the atmosphere was thick with the musty scent of decay. The corridor ahead stretched into darkness, illuminated only by the feeble glow of my flashlight. Every step echoed like a whisper, and the ancient floorboards creaked beneath my feet. My heart pounded with a mix of excitement and fear. This was my first night on the job, and I was alone in this vast, labyrinthine structure. The stories of apparitions and strange occurrences had been relayed to me with ominous warnings by the few who had dared to enter these forsaken halls. I brushed aside my unease, attributing it to nerves, and continued my patrol. As the hours dragged on, a palpable sense of isolation enveloped me. The silence was broken only by the occasional drip of water or the distant scuttling of unseen creatures. Each shadow seemed to hold secrets, each creak of the floorboards a hidden message. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that unseen eyes followed my every move. In the flickering light of my flashlight, I explored the asylum's decaying rooms. Peeling wallpaper and broken furniture bore witness to the passage of time, and the remnants of restraints and forgotten belongings hinted at the institution's grim past. The complex emotions I felt ranged from fascination to unease, as if the very walls were whispering their tragic tales. My exploration brought me to the asylum's basement, a place that had garnered a sinister reputation. The air grew colder, and the narrow passageways seemed to close in on me. My flashlight's beam danced over rusted pipes and crumbling walls, revealing graffiti left by daring trespassers and, inexplicably, the faint sound of distant laughter. Fear gnawed at the edges of my resolve. I knew I was supposed to remain vigilant, but the sense of dread was becoming overwhelming. It felt as though the asylum itself had come alive, its history of suffering and torment seeping into my very being. I couldn't help but question my decision to take this job. As I continued to explore, the laughter grew louder, echoing through the dimly lit corridors. I followed the sound to a room that had been used for shock therapy. Inside, an old leather restraint chair stood in stark contrast to the peeling floral wallpaper. The laughter seemed to emanate from the chair itself, chilling me to the bone. I hesitated, my mind racing with conflicting emotions. Curiosity battled with fear, and I knew I had a choice to make. Would I stay and confront the source of the eerie laughter, or would I retreat from this haunted place, never to return? With trembling hands, I approached the chair, my flashlight trembling in the darkness. And then, as I stood before it, the laughter ceased, replaced by an overwhelming silence that seemed to press down on me like a weight. The room felt colder than ever, and I knew that something beyond explanation had just occurred. As I left that room and made my way back to the entrance, the dread that had haunted me from the start lingered like a ghostly presence. I couldn't deny that St. Michael's Asylum held mysteries that defied explanation, and I couldn't shake the feeling that my first night on the job was just the beginning of a journey into the unknown. As the weeks turned into months, I continued my night shifts at St. Michael EOS, determined to uncover the secrets that lay hidden within its walls. The strange occurrences became a nightly occurrence. Lights flickered and dimmed at their own whims, and cold drafts seemed to emanate from nowhere. One night, as I patrolled the upper floors, I heard the faint sound of a piano playing in the distance. It was a melancholic tune, its notes haunting and beautiful. The music seemed to draw me in, and I followed it through a maze of dimly lit hallways until I reached a room at the end of a corridor. The door to the room was ajar, and as I pushed it open, the music stopped abruptly. Inside, I found a grand piano covered in a dusty white sheet. It hadn't been played in years, yet the melody had sounded so vivid. I felt a shiver run down my spine, and I couldn't help but wonder who or what had been playing that haunting tune. As I continued my rounds, I began to notice other strange phenomena. Objects moved on their own, doors slammed shut with a violent force, and whispers echoed through the hallways, their words too faint to understand. The asylum seemed to come alive at night, and its malevolent presence was impossible to ignore. One particularly chilling night, I was making my way through the basement when I heard a child's laughter, sweet and innocent, echoing through the darkness. It was a stark contrast to the horrors that had taken place within these walls. I followed the sound to a small room tucked away in a corner, its door slightly ajar. As I entered the room, the laughter ceased, and I was met with an eerie stillness. The room was empty, save for a decaying crib in the corner. It was as if the laughter had come from a ghostly child, a presence that had long since departed. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I couldn't help but feel that I was not alone in that room. As the months turned into a year, I became consumed by the mysteries of St. Michael's Asylum. I researched its history, trying to uncover the stories of the patients who had suffered within its walls. The more I learned, the more I realized that the horrors of this place ran deeper than I could have ever imagined. One night, as I delved deeper into my research, I stumbled upon a name that sent a chill down my spine. Dr. Nathaniel Blackwood, the asylum's former director. He had been a notorious figure in the field of psychiatry, known for his cruel and inhumane experiments on patients. It was said that he had conducted his most horrific experiments in the very basement of the asylum. I couldn't help but wonder if the malevolent presence that lingered in the building was somehow connected to Dr. Blackwood's dark legacy. Had his tormented soul become trapped within these walls, forever seeking retribution for the atrocities he had committed? One night, as I ventured into the basement once again, I felt a presence behind me. I turned to find a figure shrouded in darkness, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. It was a silhouette of a man, and as I stared into those piercing eyes, I felt a wave of terror wash over me. The figure raised a finger to its lips in a silent gesture, and I knew that it wanted me to be silent, to keep its presence a secret. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, as the figure faded back into the shadows. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized that I had encountered something truly malevolent, something that defied all reason. As the years went by, I continued my night shifts at St. Michael's Asylum, bearing witness to the unexplainable and the horrifying. The apparitions and strange occurrences persisted, and I couldn't help but feel that the asylum itself was a living, breathing entity, a repository of darkness and despair. I often wondered if I would ever uncover the truth behind the mysteries of St. Michael S., if I would ever find a way to free the tormented souls that lingered within its walls. But for now, I remained trapped in a never-ending nightmare, my nights filled with dread and astonishment, and my days haunted by the knowledge that the asylum held secrets that would forever remain hidden in the shadows. The looming silhouette of the Monroeville power plant emerged out of the darkness as I drove along the deserted road. My headlights cut through the night, illuminating the ominous structure. It was my first shift as a night security guard here, and a feeling of unease settled heavily in my gut. Just a year ago, disaster had struck this facility. A catastrophic accident during routine maintenance had triggered an explosion and resultant meltdown in the plant's main reactor. The Monroeville meltdown, as the media dubbed it, ultimately claimed the lives of 6 workers. Their deaths were ruled accidental, but rumors swirled that negligence and ignored safety warnings had led to the tragedy. As I parked and made my way inside, I couldn't ignore the creepy ambiance that permeated the plant. The cavernous turbine room, usually throbbing with the drone of machinery, was unnervingly silent. The metal walkways and railings were bathed in the dim red glow of the emergency lights. Looming in shadowy corners were the hulking, lifeless forms of the turbines, like ancient iron beasts lying dormant. My footsteps echoed through the stillness as I began my rounds. The deeper I went into the plant, the more its troubled history weighed on me. I imagined the now deceased workers moving through these same corridors just a year prior, unaware of their impending doom. Turning a corner, I came upon the sealed doors of the plant's control room. Police tape still crisscrossed the entrance, which had been closed off since the meltdown. Peering through the small windows, I could see the extent of the damage within. The walls and equipment were blackened and warped from the intense heat of the explosion. The acrid stench of burnt metal and chemicals permeated the air, even through the door. Standing here, outside this tragic epicenter, a strange chill raced down my spine despite the hot, heavy air. I could almost hear the alarms blaring and screams echoing through the panicked chaos as disaster unfolded. Shuddering, I moved on quickly from the grim sight. Later in my shift, I returned to the control room to check that the sealed door had not been tampered with. As I shone my flashlight along the warped walls, I noticed the temperature dropping rapidly around me. My breath came out in frosty puffs as an icy draft swirled through the room. I spun around, sweeping my light across the space. Where was this freak, unnatural cold coming from? That's when I first heard it. A drawn-out, mournful wail that seemed to emanate from the ruined equipment itself. I stumbled back, a spike of fear piercing my heart. The unearthly cry rose and fell, like the pained howl of an injured beast. But undercutting it were distinct human tones, voices of anguish and despair. I fled the control room, my mind racing over what I had experienced. I told myself it was stress or fatigue playing tricks on my mind. But over subsequent nights, the phenomena only grew more intense. Flickering lights and cold spots became common occurrences in the most damaged parts of the plant. I frequently heard the echo of footsteps following just behind me, only to find no one there when I turned. Equipment activated inexplicably, keeping me on edge. But most chilling of all were the voices. Heart-wrenching pleas for help, sobbing whispers, mournful wails. They never fully formed into distinct words, yet they conveyed a deep sense of fear and suffering. I began dreading my shifts, feeling utterly helpless against these paranormal events. After a week of bizarre activity escalating, I decided to investigate where it all seemed focused: the sealed control room. Approaching the police tape across the door, I steeled my nerves before slipping under it. I had to know if I was losing my mind or if something sinister haunted this place. Stepping inside, I swept my flashlight over the familiar burnt walls and equipment. "If any spirits are here, give me a sign," I whispered tentatively. For a moment, all was silent. Then, a bone-chilling rush of icy wind swirled through the room, scattering ash and debris. I shivered violently, arms prickling with goosebumps. That's when I saw them. Shadowy, human-like silhouettes gathered by the melted control panel. Their edges wavered like heat distortion, faces blurred and indistinct. But their anguished voices came through undeniably clear. "Why didn't they listen to us?" a shaken male voice lamented. "We told them the reactor was unstable." "It wasn't our fault," a woman's voice sobbed. "We were only doing our jobs when it exploded." My jaw hung open, and I sank to my knees. These were the spirits of the workers who had perished here, still trapped, reliving their final, terrified moments. In the nights that followed, I made contact with the lost souls whenever my shift took me past that sealed control room door. I brought offerings of flowers and candles, which seemed to calm their restless energy. Sometimes we would talk, and in their spectral voices I heard the full tragedy of what had occurred. Piece by piece, I gathered the truth. Negligent management had ignored the workers' safety concerns. On that fateful day, fail-safe after fail-safe catastrophically malfunctioned, triggering the deadly meltdown. Fearing for their jobs, the workers had kept quiet until it was too late. The spirits clung to this place out of the injustice of their deaths. They needed someone to hear their truth without judgment and remember them as more than victims of an accident. I made it my duty to give them that peace. On my last night shift at the plant, I left a plaque honoring each lost soul by name. They had entrusted me with their unresolved pain, and I hoped I had helped them find some solace. As I drove away from the looming plant that final dawn, I knew the truth of what had happened there. And I knew the spirits trapped within could now rest, their truth acknowledged, their voices finally heard. The Monroeville meltdown would haunt me forever, but now as a tragedy that through understanding could evoke change, not fear.